Okay, good morning. Good morning. Welcome back to Thinking Critically, Living Biblically, attending to Scripture in a complex modern world. It looks like we're still welcoming our 8:30 worshipers into our space. It sounds like it was an excellent worship service in there this morning. So I'm going to start us off with a couple of announcements today, or as Matt likes to call them, additional fun things. First of all, the Bible 101 videos from the Zoom class that Matt taught this October, those are now posted on the adult education website. If you weren't able to catch those, or if you could only make it for some of them, you're welcome to go and find those videos there. And then we have a Wednesday evening series coming up in Advent. There'll be worship at 6 p.m. on Wednesday evenings. This is December 3rd, 10th, and 17th. There's a 6 p.m. worship service in Westminster Hall, and then Matt is going to be teaching a Hopes of Advent series. He'll be looking at the characters in the Christmas story who are anticipating and hoping for the arrival of Jesus, and it'll be both Matt, it'll be a scholarly deep dive into those texts, but it'll also be questions about what does that hope mean in us today. So it'll be something spiritual, something scholarly. Please feel free to attend this class. There's no need to register. It's not on Zoom, but it will be live streamed. So you can either come in person, make an evening of it, come to dinner in Fellowship Hall, and then a worship service, and then Matt's class, or if you need to be home, you can catch it on the live stream as well. So we're looking forward to that series coming up. Today we're talking about crime and punishment, and I'm going to start by asking you, what comes to mind when you think about crime and punishment in the Bible? What stories or texts or general impressions come to you? And we'll, if we've got a member of the Adult Ed Council with the mic, we'll pass that around. We'll do this as a large group. When you think about the themes of crime and punishment, yeah, I see Jennifer in the back. Let's see. And Doris,
the woman taken in adultery.
The woman taken in adultery, yeah. And what does Jesus say to the crowd? Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Right. So it's this story that captures this question of who is innocent, who is guilty, what does punishment mean for a crime, what does it take for a society to enact a punishment. It's a beautiful story, and a story of mercy and forgiveness as well. Other stories or texts that you can think of. Yeah. The cross, right? Jesus is not the only one crucified. There are 3 crosses together. What does that say about Jesus's death in particular, situated within the larger context of the Roman legal system? Jesus seems to forgive one of the people being crucified with him. There's an aspect of forgiveness there, but then there's also larger questions about the practice of crucifixion as a punishment generally, whether that is ever merited or warranted. Yeah. Any other texts or stories? I see in the back. Yes, Doris is just ping-ponging across the room here.
This is more just a general thing and an impression, so it may be accurate, it may be inaccurate, but it seems like in the Old Testament, the Israelites had a great tradition of falling away and falling away, and then God redeeming them and falling away and falling away. So this idea that they didn't keep the statutes and the ordinances, right, and then God withdrew his support.
Sure.
So
yeah. No, you're pointing to these themes that will sort of come up again and again, which is in the Old Testament we often see crime and punishment really within the context of the people's relationship to God. We'll talk a lot today about what does the Bible envision for a system of justice that humans would work out amongst themselves, but always especially in the Older Testament, there's this idea that the people as a whole are in relationship to God. One of the major sort of schools of thought embedded in the Bible, the Deuteronomistic history, seems to interpret the calamities that befall the people as punishments from God for their failure to observe the law in certain ways. So not just a sense of individuals punished for their transgressions, but the people as a whole in their relationship to God. And yet there is a dimension of relationality in this, right? We sometimes we think Old Testament legalism, if you don't obey the letter of the law, you're in trouble with God. But there's also really a sense here of this being something that is embedded in the context of this relationship of God's steadfast love of the people, and a sense of God returning to the people again and again. So there's sort of a both and. It can be easy to think of, Old Testament law, New Testament grace, but really in both Testaments we see elements of both, because there's plenty of judgment that shows up in the Newer Testament as well. Yeah, we have chairs available in the front as well. So any other passages here or stories? I see Paul in the front. Doris is, yeah. She's coming with the mic, yeah.
In the Older Testament, you could go to the gate, and the elders would be able to hear your issue.
Mm-hmm.
And there's sometimes stories about a surprise response that results in forgiveness or some kind of not punishment that they thought was going to happen.
Sure, yeah. There are provisions for sort of community working out of questions of justice, of dispute resolution. We won't go as much into that. I've had to really sort of narrow a focus today, but you're right. There's questions about how do we handle dispute resolution, and that includes flexibility for those tasked with deciding cases. We see this going back to, in Exodus, Moses trying to judge all of the cases himself, and then his father-in-law Jethro saying, maybe you should delegate, right? Maybe you should appoint some other judges who can help you sort of work through the caseload that you have. Yeah. Well, so, Doris. Rocky, go ahead.
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel, yeah. We begin. The first act outside of Eden is a homicide. And we'll start there and say, what does this say about the nature of the crime that's committed? What does it say about the sort of what sort of theories of punishment are engaged here? And how does the Bible sort of trace this throughout the story of the Older Testament? So we'll get right into it. Let's start with just one of the most famous lines about crime and punishment in the Bible: an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We see Jesus here in the Sermon on the Mount saying, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And then Jesus goes on to complexify that notion and suggest a different way. But this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth notion is contained within the text of the law in Exodus. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So this is basic retaliation. If somebody hurts you in one way, you can hurt them back in the same way. Does anybody know what this is called? The technical sort of legal term for this. Reciprocity, so retribution. There's a Latin word, lex talionis, for this, which means the law of retaliation. And it's often articulated as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And this is a basic principle of justice. If you have little children, right? Fair's fair. You hit your brother hits you back, right? Kathy, I see you had your hand up.
Another element of that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is that it has to be an eye for an eye and not an eye for your eye and your legs and your hands. I mean, it keeps it on a level that there's no over reciprocity.
Yes, yeah. 100%. So this sounds barbaric to us because it involves sort of physical mutilation, right? That's what's sort of envisioned here in this way that seems very jarring. And there's a limitation built in, right, that says no more than what has occurred. It's not a life for an eye. There's a real sense of there being a sort of moral balance here and a limit on, there's sort of a recognition that experience of being harmed, the desire for vengeance can awaken in us something that will escalate things even further. So there's a sort of limitation built in here. It's also, we actually don't have any evidence in biblical stories or in archaeology or anything of ancient Israel sort of practicing this, of mutilation as punishment in ancient Israel. So this is a sort of theoretical frame here, but one that creates, as Kathy was pointing out, a balance where the punishment fits the crime. So this is the lex talionis, and it's when you look in a standard law school class about theories of punishment, this would be a sort of retribution theory of punishment, a retaliation, tit for tat, kind of a way of thinking about punishment. And thinking about crime, as Rocky said, we're gonna basically limit ourselves to homicide today. There are many other, I know. I hope this isn't being recorded. There are many other types of crimes that are described in the Bible. We have to sort of narrow things down. And as Rocky pointed out, our first act in Scripture is this homicide. We have Cain killing Abel, becoming jealous of his brother's offering to God, and then slaughtering his brother. Cain's being jealous is not a sufficient interest to, if we applied the lex talionis here, being jealous of your brother does not mean killing your brother, right? And so there's a sense that Cain has done something wrong. Notice we don't have any laws yet. We don't even have the 10 Commandments yet. There's just this general sense of wrongness in what Cain has done. He's sort of violated some norm that's baked into the created social world here, the newly created social world here. And so God says to Cain, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength, and you will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." So here, the punishment is actually not related to a life for a life. The punishment is about the ground. There's a sense in which the blood of Abel has polluted the ground in some way, that it's not just other people who might have an interest in this, but the land is in some way violated by this killing that has taken place, and that the blood has polluted the land, and that there's something about this that means that the land will no longer support the people who are on it. I think there's a really interesting sort of concept here of who is harmed, and that the land is a party that's harmed by the acts that take place on it. Cain is very worried about this. He says, "My punishment is more than I can bear. I will be a wanderer in the land. Whoever sees me will kill me." And God says, "Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance." So God marks Cain as nobody will touch him. Cain goes off with this mark that will indicate to others not to kill him. Basic question: who are these others? Not one I can answer, but the Bible pretty quickly envisions other people, and we're not sure how they got there, including Cain's wife. Where did she come from? But this is them wandering fugitives, wandering in the desert. So there's a sense in which God holds Cain accountable for his crimes, but not to that level of the lex talionis. There is, however, another interest in punishment, another sort of theory of punishment that's at work here, and this is the theory of deterrence. So the punishment is not just about the wrongdoer who has already created a harm. It's also about preventing future wrongdoing. It's setting an example that will prevent other people from doing the same thing. It's not just a sort of balancing out of what's been done, but it's this forward-looking way of saying, what do we want people to know about the consequences of their actions, and how might knowledge of those consequences prevent them from carrying out similar wrongs in the future? And so we see a little of this deterrence interest taking part in another very familiar biblical story, which is Noah's Ark, believe it or not. We think of Noah's Ark as this gentle story where Noah builds a special boat, and the animals go in 2 by 2, and we have toys and they fuzzy felts, and they show up in our Bible. But Noah's Ark, there's a real sort of depth to this story in terms of what it says about humanity. It begins 2 chapters after Cain and Abel with God looking down and seeing that the wickedness of humankind was great. There's a sense that humans are acting out, that there's not a sort of moral compass in the society. They're all just doing whatever they want, every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts, and it was only evil continually. And so the Lord was sorry about having made the world and decides to destroy it from the face of the earth, and then realizes there's this one righteous guy, Noah, and God will make an exception, and that's where we get Noah's Ark. So there's a sense that humans are behaving in this lawless way on the earth. And then at the end of the flood story, After the flood, we get the rainbow, right? And Noah makes an altar and celebrates with all the animals around him. And God promises never again to destroy the earth by flood. But there's also the giving of two provisions, two points of law that show up here that are sort of universally applicable. So the first is, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. So people had been vegetarians up until this point, according to the biblical story. If you think about Eden, they're eating of the trees, but not of the animals. The animals are helpers. And so here, there's this permission to eat meat, but not with the blood. Again, sort of something special set apart about the blood that has to do with its sort of created status. So one of them is about permission to eat animals. The other requires capital punishment for murder. So for your own lifeblood, I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal, I will require it, and from every human being, each one for the blood of the other, I will require a reckoning for human life. So here, not at the very beginning, but here after the flood, is introduced this concept of a life for a life, right? This sort of capital punishment as a requirement for murder. So one of the interests here is this lex talionis, a life for a life, a balancing out. But another is deterrence, right? This is seen as kind of an antidote to the lawlessness that came before. And then there's another interest that shows up here, and we'll see this elsewhere throughout the law, which is an interest in creation, God's interest in the life of every person. So whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. Oops, going forward a little early. For in God's own image, God made humans. So there's an anchoring of this law in the creation story, in the divine origin and the sort of divine likeness of human beings. I'm going to pause. Any questions here? Okay. Don't hear me saying this as an endorsement of my own view of, this is just sort of a way that we can see these interests sort of playing out in the biblical story. So our next step is to get to the covenant at Sinai. So here's Moses receiving the law. Genesis is where we get Cain and Abel in the flood story. Exodus, we have the giving of the law, and this is Moses receiving the 10 Commandments from God. A couple things to say about this covenant. So as we've already heard pointed out at the very beginning, right, there's this theocratic orientation here, that this is about how people relate to God. We saw that even in this universal law that applies to Noah about not murdering other people and the penalty for murdering other people. But we see it here in terms of the covenant. It's just baked right in. It's all the way through. The covenant is going to include, without distinction, provisions that we would call moral, social, economic, ritual, criminal. All of them are sort of bound up together in these chapters. And if you go back to our series on the Older Testament, Anna Marsh, in the video that she did for us on Leviticus, really encourages us not to try to separate them out, not to sort of say, well, there are some moral laws that now apply and some ritual laws that no longer do. It's sort of a classic Protestant move to do that. And she says we really need to see this as all of a piece of how the people as a whole were relating to God. This is a set of laws that comes from different historical periods. They're all presented as being given sort of here in the Torah, first at Sinai, and then some more laws are given during the book of Numbers and then in Deuteronomy, but they really reflect different historical periods from the life of Israel. Some points in which the Israelites had autonomy over what their legal system would look like, other times during exile when they were under the thumb of an empire and were really just sort of trying to reimagine what law could be. And the things that I'll talk about, the examples that I'll give, are not necessarily enforced, right? It's important when we look at this, at the laws in the Older Testament, not to think of them as though they come from statutes, or that you could, pull down a volume from your shelf of the U.S. Code and look it up and it would be in there because it's been passed by a legislature. We don't have trial transcripts for how these things played out. We don't have case law around this. This is really given as a body of teaching for the people. And so as I go through, what's included in the law here, we're not to sort of think of that as reflecting necessarily what actually happened in ancient Israel, and certainly not how Jews read or understand law today. But we can get a sense of what's valued. We can get a sense of what picture of human nature is embedded in the law and what kind of society is God asking the people to build together in relationship to God. So as I said, we're focusing on homicide. We see it in the 10 Commandments, you shall not murder. And there, it's just given as an unconditional, undifferentiated prohibition without any stated punishment. And it also seems to say that there's not exceptions for accident. There's also not a provision here for putting somebody to death who has committed murder. We get in Exodus 21, which is this is slightly after the 10 Commandments, the covenant code, a larger elaboration of the law. We get whoever strikes a person mortally shall be put to death. So here there's an authorization for killing that takes place judicially in response to a murder. But to Walt's question, what happens if it's an accident? If it was not premeditated, but came about by an act of God, then I will appoint for you a place to which the killer may flee. So if this is not a premeditated crime, there may be some exceptions here. And this place to which the killer may flee it's a city of refuge that will sort of slow down the process, slow down the vengeance process, permit there to be a kind of trial where testimony is given, where elders can sort out how do we want to respond here, what is the just thing to do. Of course, if somebody willfully attacks and kills another person by treachery, you shall take the killer from my altar for execution. So this home base, this city of refuge, this place of safety does not apply in cases of willful, premeditated killing or treachery. Weirdly, that's a judgment word right there. So there does seem to be an exception here for crimes that are committed in the heat of passion. If a killing that takes place in the context of a quarrel maybe falls a little bit closer to the accidental category than the premeditated category. So there does seem to be distinction based on whether you in cold blood thought about this ahead of time, whether it happens in the heat of the moment, whether it happens by accident. A sort of sense of intentionality seems to be built in here. And then these are the cities of refuge. We get a slightly different list of cities in Numbers versus Exodus, but there's a general sense there's 6 of them. They helped to slow down the retaliation process. The killer would flee to a city of refuge, and there would be a trial either there or at the site of the killing. There does seem to be some forum choice possible here. If the murder is premeditated, then the avenger of blood can put the killer to death. Who is the avenger of blood? It's a relative. Yeah, it's a family member, somebody who would have that interest to sort of carry out that lex talionis, life for life action. But if it's an accidental killing, then the killer may live, they have to remain in the city of refuge until the high priest dies. Which, again, to us, that might seem, what does the high priest have to do with this? But there's a sense, too, of the pollution of the land by an act of killing. So it's not just the people who have an interest, but the land as well. And that atonement for the killer, even in this case of an accident or something that happens in the heat of passion, is not possible until the death of the high priest who's consecrated that city. So there's a sort of slowing down of everything that's happening here, and part of that has to do with how the land is responding to the wrongs that have taken place within it. Let's see. A couple of provisions for how homicide is adjudicated. So no one shall be put to death on the testimony of a single witness. You need at least 2 witnesses to carry out the death penalty. And here, this is an interesting one. You shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who is subject to the death penalty. A murderer shall be put to death. There's no getting out of this by means of a ransom payment. Any thoughts about this? That there's no provision for any other kind of sentence here? Yeah, I see Paula. Yeah, I'll just repeat that back. Regardless of your economic status, it applies. And this is so it was very hard for me in preparing for this to wrap my head around this, right? That there would be a sort of equality interest in mandating capital punishment. That's not how I'm wired. But here, it's saying that payment doesn't get you out of this, that that you can't, that a human life is more valuable than any monetary payment. And so the only reciprocity for it is another human life. It means that the rich don't get a buy. Yeah, Jim. Or paying off the witness. I think, yeah, this doesn't mean actually paying off the witness. This is really about you could pay a ransom to the relatives in order to avoid the death penalty. And this is, so in other ancient societies, this was not the case. Let's see, this is more about the land being polluted and defiled. Yeah, so looking at neighboring law codes, this is the Code of Hammurabi. A ransom could be paid instead of capital punishment, and it had to do with the social status of the perpetrator and the victim, whether a ransom was allowable or possible. So there was a way in which other ancient societies often would have this provision that would distinguish among penalties based on your social status and your ability to pay. And so thinking about that actually, to me, feels quite close to home in terms of thinking about how our justice system operates here. This is Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative. He says that we have to reform a system of criminal justice that continues to treat people better if they are rich and guilty than if they are poor and innocent. There's a way in which in our own justice system, access to resources gives you access to counsel. Theoretically, it shouldn't, but the outcomes are entirely different based on race, based on economic status. So we actually have currently a criminal justice system that's sort of failing to uphold the standard of equal penalty regardless of social standing. Of course, ancient Israel was not a paragon of this by any means. If we recall back to Matt's session on racism, and enslavement in the Older Testament, or in the Bible, and he said that there's basically a baseline acceptance of enslavement as a social practice. Here we have, when a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. If the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. So here we have a sense of there being some wiggle room, there being a different set of treatment for if we're talking about an enslaved person versus a freed person. There does seem to be a sense that if a person who's enslaved is injured, then the owner will give that person their freedom as compensation for the injury. And so it seems to be this sort of mix. In some ways, it seems as though enslaved people are thought to have a property interest in their own bodies. In other cases, it seems like not. So the Older Testament is full of contradictions. It is not a paragon of equality in a way that we might want it to be. But there are places in which we see that impulse, and that the death penalty and the lack of ransom for it is one of them. I'm going to keep moving us along in terms of theories of punishment here. We talked about retribution and deterrence. There's a sense of punishment as compensation that wends its way through the way that the Older Testament talks about punishment as well. In the American judicial system, we might differentiate between compensatory damages and punitive damages. They seem to be kind of bound up together in the way that the Torah is talking about punishment here. So when someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, the thief shall pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. This seems to have punitive and compensatory damages sort of built in together here. There's another provision for individuals quarreling and striking one another, and there's a period of disability that ensues. There's a payment for lost time and arrangement for recovery. So there it seems to be compensation, but not added punishment, because you see this is happening in the midst of the heat of passion. There's a quarrel already taking place. So this is sort of how compensation gets kind of woven in to this theory of punishment as well. One theory of punishment that's going to be missing from my list of how this is operating in the Older Testament is incapacitation. There's a sense of that in one sort of contemporary theory of punishment is that, especially imprisonment, incapacitates a wrongdoer so that they can't create further harms. There's not a system of prisons in the Older Testament. Imprisonment sort of wasn't on the table as an option for punishment. And so we don't see that in this list in the Older Testament. We see a little bit of rehabilitation as a theory of punishment. Is there a way in which punishment helps to sort of reform the wrongdoer? We see this a little bit in sort of the American penal context, at least as an impulse, if not as a reality, right? The penitentiary system in Pennsylvania was created by the Quakers as a way to provide solitary opportunities for wrongdoers to repent and reflect and reform. Of course, what this functionally turned out to be was solitary confinement, and it was terrible for people. So that impulse failed, right? We also see that sometimes our prison systems have things like job training or educational opportunities, that it's not primarily a rehab. If our real interest in punishment in this country was rehabilitation, we do it much differently, but that sense of reform does kind of show up. It doesn't show up a ton in the Older Testament as a theory of punishment. There's a line about this in Proverbs, that blows that wound cleanse away evil, beatings make clean the inmost parts, that there's this sense of like there's somehow this is reforming a wrongdoer, but it's not a primary animating impulse of this theory of punishment in the Older Testament. And so the final theory of punishment that I'll talk about is punishment as restoration. This is a little bit different from rehabilitation. If rehabilitation is about reform of the wrongdoer, restoration, restorative justice, is about incorporating that person back into the fabric of community without neglecting accountability for the wrong that was done. And this can be done in incredibly powerful. If we think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa as sort of a primary example of restorative justice, of saying, what does it take to knit a society back together where you have people who are victims of incredible harm, people who have perpetrated incredible harm? How can they possibly live together? And it sometimes involves engaging in dialogues. The goal is ensuring that offenders understand the harm that's been caused and take responsibility from their actions and are no longer going to commit harms. There's a safety interest in restorative justice too. I would commend to you one of the resources of our denomination. We talked about this at the Adult Ed Council the other night about using some of our denomination's resources and position papers in this class as ways of thinking about how is the wider church reflecting on biblically on some of these issues. And our denomination has a resolution on restorative justice. It gives a definition of restorative justice and then anchors it in biblical concepts of shalom and the kingdom of God. And so it's looking at restorative justice not necessarily as something we see evidence of being practiced in the Bible, but as based on principles that we can derive from Scripture. So it gives a scriptural frame to this restorative justice framework. We see again, just as with the lex talionis, we see that restorative justice can be grounded in creation in the image and likeness of God. And so we're saying not just the victim, but also the wrongdoer, created in the image and likeness of God. It's grounded in the reality of sin. There's a quote from Romans, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, that there's less of a distinction between us and them in a restorative justice framework. And this sort of holistic view of justice as shalom, right? Not just a sort of righting of wrongs, a balancing of accounts, but as a sort of holistic well-being of the wider culture. And it also, and this sort of falls in with Jesus' tendency to subvert our division of people into us and them, people who do right and people who do wrong. It points out that this can be grounded in the Older Testament. This is not in contrast to the Older Testament's view of law and justice. That in fact, to sort of call the Older Testament a legalistic document is to make it a caricature of it, because it is also grounded in relationship. It's to say that the fundamental orientation of the Bible, including the Older Testament, is to sustain, or where broken, to restore the covenantal relationships and the covenantal bonds of human community. So I'm giving this to you as an example of what can be done with with Scripture in terms of thinking about our contemporary context? Do we just need to go digging in the Bible for quotations that support our point of view? Do we need to look for a biblical frame for things? Or can we say, what are the values that underlie this? What are the threads that we see again and again? And this is an example of making a sort of constructive biblical argument for the case of restorative justice. We have a number of position papers. We have one on capital punishment. We don't take the Bible's view of capital punishment, that it should not be commuted no matter your economic status. We come out very much against capital punishment. We're not the only denomination that does this. The Catholic Church has position papers like this as well. They're grounded in the Bible and also the Church's teaching. And this is one about the criminal justice system. Catholics often also oppose capital punishment out of a pro-life stance, actually, that any taking of a life, including a capital punishment, is wrong. So this is sort of how the Church currently is using the Scriptures to make arguments, to think through how we understand crime and punishment. Let's look. We've looked some at the Older Testament and how the Older Testament understands criminal justice. Let's look at the Newer Testament too. We're in a very different context in the Newer Testament. The people that the Newer Testament is writing to have a very different social location and a different level of access to power. At certain points in the history of ancient Israel, Israel was autonomous. It had a king. They were able to set up their own justice systems. The law in the Older Testament reflects that opportunity to self-govern. Not so in the New Testament context, right? So we have people who are experiencing oppression under the thumb of an empire, the Romans, whose justice system is what they're dealing with, whether they want it to be or not. There's not that sense of autonomy. And they're still very much enmeshed in Torah as a way of life. The law of the Torah is still very much active and valid, but it's the Romans who are the ones who have the sort of ultimate say here. And being a Roman citizen versus not being a Roman citizen has everything to do with how you're treated in the New Testament context here. So we have Jesus saying, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile." So here we see Jesus deliberately refuting that lex talionis principle and encouraging this ethic of nonviolence, an ethic of forgiveness. He also, in other places in this same speech, this is from the Sermon on the Mount, he takes some of the commandments and makes them deeper and more internal, so that commandment not to murder, he expands to say it's not just about not murdering people, it's about whoever harbors anger towards a brother or a sister, right, is liable. So there's a sense that Jesus is taking this legal system and saying, let's think of this morally, let's think of this internally, let's think of this in terms of the things that we can control, in the ways that this shapes our character, that shapes our relationships. Because he's not setting up a new law that he can enforce on earth. That said, he does get angry and hold people accountable for injustice. So this is a scene of Jesus, this is El Greco of Jesus cleansing the money changers out of the temple. This is people who are practicing oppressive economic exploitation within the context of the temple. And he drives them out. He won't have anything to do with this. So on the one hand, we have this turn the other cheek ethic that he's teaching. On the other hand, when he encounters people who are doing harm to other people, there are times that he holds them accountable to this behavior, in this case by driving them out of the temple. So we see a sort of both and with Jesus here. And when Jesus talks about the final judgment, when he talks about God's final judgment on the world, there's an element of accountability for wrongdoing there too. Jesus' forgiveness ethic is not to say that those harms done don't matter, right? That there really is a sense of appreciation for what it is to be on the other side of an oppressive empire. And in his initial sermon, he talks about what he's sent to do, and it's to proclaim release to the captives, right? There's a sense that part of Jesus's mission here is to proclaim justice, to proclaim what is wrong with the world. And then there's a pastoral dimension of this too. This is Matthew 25. I was in prison and you visited me. This is in that list of acts of mercy that Jesus is calling his disciples to. And one of them is about visiting those who are in prison. In the ancient, so now we do have prisons, right? So we didn't have prisons in the Older Testament context. We do in the Newer Testament context. Visiting a person in prison was not just an act of social companionship. It was also about providing for basic needs in the prison. You weren't necessarily being fed unless your friends were coming to visit you and give you food and sustenance and nurture. This is a matter not just of solace, but also of survival. And we get this exhortation about visiting those who are in prison in the context of Matthew 25, which is a passage about the final judgment, right? About God at the end of the era sorting out those who have done these acts of mercy from those who have ignored the plight of people who are imprisoned or sick or thirsty or hungry or naked. There is a sense here of a justice system that's a divine justice system, a divine judgment of the holding to account that happens, even if we're not saying this is something that human beings are setting up here on earth. So the last thing that I want us to think about, and actually to have you all talk about, is the fact that this sense of powerlessness in the face of empire and what does power mean in the face of that powerlessness is built into the very center of our Christian story. Because if we think about criminal justice in the biblical system, in the biblical story, the place that we encounter it the most starkly is the cross, right? The person here who is put to death as a perpetrator is Jesus. He is the one who is tried and sentenced and condemned to die and then executed. So our scripture really, especially in the Newer Testament, puts us in the mindset of those who are looking at the foot of the cross and seeing a leader who has been executed by the criminal justice system of ancient Rome. And so what do we do with this, right? What do we do with the way that the story shifts on us here and is not about how do we put those other wrongdoers to, how do we, create a system of punishments, but how do we look at somebody who has been unjustly condemned and put to death? James Cone talks about this in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and does this reframe. He says, the cross as a locus of divine revelation is not good news for the powerful, for those who are comfortable with the way things are, or for anyone whose understanding of religion is aligned with power. The religious authorities of Jesus' time were threatened by his teachings about the reign of God's justice and love, and the state authorities executed him as an insurrectionist, one who perverts the nation and stirs up the people. And Cone is connecting this in particular to the context of lynching in North America, in the United States. He says, theologically speaking, Jesus was the first lynchee who foreshadowed all the lynched black bodies on American soil. He was crucified by the same powers and principalities that lynched black people in America. Because God was present with Jesus on the cross and thereby refused to let Satan and death have the last word about his meaning, God was also present at every lynching in the United States. What Cone is doing here is mapping the story of the cross onto the story of American justice and American injustice, and saying that we can analogize here Jesus' death to that experience of lynching, this unjust killing that took place all throughout this country. And so he draws this theological and scriptural connection here. And I think when we look at the Newer Testament and the understanding of justice, we need to be confronted by the fact that what we've got at the center of the system of justice is our Savior on a cross. So I want to ask you guys to think about this in small groups, and then we'll come back as a larger group at your tables. What does this mean for our understanding of justice? That in Jesus, we have somebody who shows up primarily, at least in our gospel context, there's a promise that he will return as a future judge, but he shows up as the one being executed. What does that say to us about our own systems of justice and how we understand justice and judgment? I'll give you guys about 7 minutes on that, and then we'll come back. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to call us back together. Love to hear what you've been discussing at your tables on this question or otherwise. Anything to share with the larger group here?
Do I want to share?
All right,
Okay.
Camilla.
Oh, okay. I've been elected. Well, I just said, I guess what I was thinking about the cross is the cross was a terrible, horrible, evil instrument of torture and death. And the Romans wanted Jesus forgotten and tortured and killed. And what happened is that the cross became a symbol, a unification symbol, for millions of people of eternal life, of resurrection, joy. So it didn't work out for them.
Yeah,
For
yeah.
the
No,
Romans.
I heard that overheard that at another table too. Like that there is a way in which the cross becomes. There's this inversion that happens. That the cross becomes this powerful symbol. That God is stronger than death. That good is stronger than evil. Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
You've been talking about some of the physical crimes,
Sure.
killing someone, thievery, that sort of stuff. You haven't really touched on blasphemy.
Sure.
Blasphemy was a crime
Yeah.
which our church has punished at many different points in time.
Sure.
You go back not that long ago to the Protestant Reformation. Catholics burned Protestant theologians.
Sure.
And when the Presbyterians were in power in various places, they used that power to try and enforce an orthodoxy. And as Paul was pointing out, within our lifetimes, lynchings still occurred.
Yeah.
And yet, oftentimes, good Christian people did not speak out
Yeah.
against any of that. And so there is a message here that the church and power have a very tenuous relationship.
Yeah.
And if the church has power, its example is not necessarily the example of Christ on the cross.
Yes, that is a great point. That when the church has power, the church is often on the side of injustice. We see that. You see that in all different stripes of Christianity. John Calvin, even the put Ursinus to death. There's. This is the church does not have a great track record here. And as you're right, in the Bible, there's the death penalty is prescribed for more things than murder, for blasphemy, for being a witch, for cursing one's parents. It is punishable by death, it says. Again, theoretical, not necessarily enforced. And part of it is this aspect of this theocratic orientation, right? The Ten Commandments. There's some are about our relationships with each other. Some of them are about our relationship to God, and the death penalty could be named as the punishment for a variety of things. And the church has taken this and used it to exercise power in all kinds of unjust ways, or to stand by while extrajudicial killings take place. And so to me, that amplifies the importance of the reframe that happens on the cross. Jesus's relationship to power, Jesus's relationship to Jesus not setting up a society where he takes vengeance on his enemies, right? But there's this submission to them that takes place on the cross, and that has become the central symbol of our faith. Yeah, other comments from the tables? Yes, I see Dwayne.
Well, if we went around this room, as we did in the men's book group this month, and asked the immigrant background of our predecessors in the family, virtually everyone had an immigrant story. So we are all descendants of immigrants. So that, I think, should cast perspective on the U.S. policies regarding immigration and immigrants.
Sure. So you're talking about the current experience of Border Patrol being in cities, ICE detentions, things happening sort of outside the legal process there. Yeah. And immigration is not the only way that people showed up in this country. There are populations who are indigenous to this country, whose land was forcibly taken. There are people whose ancestors were brought here against their will. All of these add to that sort of larger point of we don't seem to do justice well. Yeah. I see you in the back.
Well, I pointed out in our group that the execution was done on the basis of cowardice. Pilate could have said, no, this guy hadn't done anything. He just said something against your religion. But the mob said to him, give us Barabbas. And you don't want to make Caesar mad. Right. And what did he do? Caved in.
Yeah. That there's a lot.
There was a law for... He had the power to say this guy hadn't done anything wrong.
Mm-hmm. Pilate has culpability in this too, and that has something to say. The story of the crucifixion has so much to tell us about the human condition, but those who are in positions of power and have the opportunity to choose differently often don't, out of a sense of fear. Yeah. Anyone? Any other? We have time for one more. Love justice, do mercy, and walk humbly with your God. That's a great place to end it. Thank you, Jim. Thank you for the good discussion today.